So, thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here. I have been writing for games for a while now. This is the first game I worked on. Look at the CD-ROM crack. You can see how old I am. This was a slumber party game for girls, and there were 4 little girls on screen that talked the whole time, so this was my first job. Soon after, I worked on this job. You can see how one would lead to the other, of course. I've worked on about 25 games, some of which were terrible and some of which were good. I was lucky enough to work with Ken Levine on BioShock, which of course won some writing awards, Far Cry 2, which was nominated for some writing awards, and Tomb Raider, which was also nominated for some awards and rightfully lost to another great game, Last of Us, which has a phenomenal story. And I mention this because we've been working on putting stories into games for a long time now, years and years. But the irony, of course, is that games don't always need a story, right? Film needs a story, TV needs a story, a book needs a story, but games, maybe. Sorry, I have to look at this to do my notes while I'm talking with you. Yes. So games don't need story, but they do need a purpose. They need a point. And story is a great way of creating meaning in games. So we're going to keep trying to make it happen. And the question that I'm asking myself now at this point in my career is, how are we doing? Are we getting any better at telling stories in games? And to answer that question, we can look at other mediums. So for example, plays. Plays are quite good, yeah? This guy, Shakespeare, wrote plays that were so great that even now, even though the language has moved on, we present these plays in the language in which they were written because we don't want to miss a beat, right? Movies are quite good. They've come quite far from the early days when they would just put the movie camera in the play and film the play. Now they're quite sophisticated, and I probably should have put up The Godfather or Citizen Kane, but I love Rushmore, so this to me is an example of a perfect movie. TV is also quite good now, I think we could safely say, yeah? So how are we doing? What's the best that we can do? Yay! Which is pretty good, but I think we have farther to go. I don't think we've seen the best days of storytelling in games. As good as these are, and as good as the games that some of us have worked on, I think there's more we can do. So that's really what I want to talk about today, which is what has to change? Do we need to get better writers? Well, we've had games hire professional writers. Yes, that did improve the quality. Do we need better graphics? We have better graphics. Do we need better voice actors? We have better voice actors. We've tried a lot of different things to make stories and games better. And it's improved things, but we aren't as good as we could be. So my question is, hello, maybe the issue is not the tools or the talent, but the question is the structure that we're using to tell our stories. Maybe there's something about the basic building blocks of story that we need to look at and revisit to work for this medium. There's a specific way of telling stories in each medium, right? And what is our specific way? That's what I want to talk about today. So let me start. Any questions so far, by the way? I know we'll have questions afterwards, but you can also ask me questions during if you like. So let's start with like I said, the building blocks, the fundamentals of story. On a very simple level, every story is about desire and obstacle. Somebody wants something very badly and has a hard time getting it, right? And that is a no-brainer. Right? In every other form of storytelling, we see it very clearly. The main character has something he wants very badly, like Khan, and it has to work hard to get it. So, of course, in games, we have plenty of obstacles. In fact, games usually are nothing but obstacles. And we see characters that have desires in the cinematics, right? I mean, studios spend an incredible amount of time and money and effort making these beautiful cinematics with people who are full of feeling, full of need, full of desire. And so what do players do when these cinematics start? Right, exactly, right? And all that hard work goes right down the drain. Why? Do gamers not like stories? No, that's not the issue, I think. In fact, I think they like stories so much that they start telling a story to themselves about the game while they're playing it. And of course, the story they're telling themselves is about their gameplay, right? I'm killing it at this game. I'm great at this, right? And so every player's experience is unique and important to him. And if the story inside of the game doesn't match the story the player is telling himself or herself, the player is going to ignore the story completely. So is the problem the form, the way in which we're telling our story? Is it the cinematics? Is it because we can skip it and we do that we mess it up? Maybe that's the problem. Maybe we should put the story inside of the gameplay itself when we know that the player is paying attention, right? This has been an argument I've heard over and over again, and I think it has some validity, but there's a problem there as well. And to illustrate that, I'm gonna show a quick video, which is sort of a game, sort of a test, and you may have seen this before, but here we go.
Count how many times the players wearing white pass the basketball.
Has anyone done this before? Is this familiar to anyone? Okay, so shh.
How many passes did you count? The correct answer is 15 passes. But did you see the gorilla?
So since we're watching this in a group and you probably heard some people laughing, you probably did notice the gorilla. But most people who do this by themselves, sitting in front of a screen, just like all of us do when we play games, if you were concentrating and trying to count those basketball passes, half of you would have not seen the gorilla. And you're all very smart people. So it's not that you're not smart. It's that when we are working on something, we can really tune everything out, and that includes story. In games, story is the gorilla. So to me, this 1-minute video is a perfect example of the major challenge about storytelling for games. It is hard to get the player's attention, regardless of how good the story is, regardless of how big the gorilla is. Yeah? So the challenge here, I think, is this. The player has a desire line all his own, and it may have something to do with the avatar desire, but it may not. We have 2 desire lines we're working with when we make games, the players and the avatars. And we have to figure out a way to make them connect, even though we don't know the player or see him or get any feedback from him. This is quite challenging, yeah? Any questions so far about what I've said? I see a nodding face. Okay, perfect. So here's the problem that I have. How do I tell a story with a player who's telling his own story? Here's some different ways that different projects have tried to answer this question. One way is to create an avatar that doesn't really care too much, right? So when you play a game and you're like, save the princess, but then all you really think about is like jumping over barrels and climbing ladders, right? And so he wants to save the princess, but he's not really too upset about it, and neither are you as a player. So this creates player freedom and agency, but we don't get a lot of emotional connection, right? Another way that we can have this is we have an avatar who lies to themselves about what it is they really want. So I'm going to pick on Tomb Raider because I worked on it, and I'd rather criticize my own work than someone else's. And the story, which a team worked on, so I think it worked in a lot of ways, but one of the things that is very bizarre about Tomb Raider is that she says in the cinematics that she wants to get off the island, but what does she do? She explores the entire island, killing every single person she meets. Any one of whom could probably help her get off the island, by the way, if she just asked nicely. So what she should be doing is staying by the shore and looking for a boat. But that's not why you bought the game, right? You bought the game to explore, therefore that's what she does. And yet she says that she wants something else. So this technique of people saying one thing and doing another, we see in movies and television and other media, and it works quite well because it makes them complicated and interesting. But in games, it makes you disconnect from them. Make sense? Okay, but at least it's an effort towards a solution. We're starting to see more shifts towards the player's avatar being a character separate from the player, as opposed to, say, a sock puppet, right? Which is how older games used to work. You would just sort of put the sock puppet on, and then your hand would move through the world, correct? But now we're starting to see, with the technology changing, that we can give the avatar's personality and then invite the player to play along with his own avatar, yeah? So one example would be with Mass Effect 3. In this game, as you guys know, I'm sure, you were able to do voice commands. You could, when the dialogue tree came up, you could say the line. And when some people heard about this, they were like, that is going to be stupid, because I'm going to say the line, and then my avatar is going to say the line, and that's going to be stupid. Or I'm going to say the line, and then my avatar will just stand there, not saying anything, which will be stupid. But they came up with an interesting solution. So I'm going to show a little clip from E3. The dialogue is not the best, but the interaction is interesting, and we'll discuss it after the video.
Yes. Placed her in protective isolation. Recommend gentle approach. Krogan slow to trust.
I don't need her trust.
I'm Commander Shepard, Alliance Navy.
Are you here to kill me?
Of course not.
We're here to take you home.
Why? What am I to you?
You're the Krogan's last hope.
You're the future of the Krogan race. I'm fighting for that.
Then I hope you brought an army.
So that was interesting. The player spoke, and then the avatar sort of finished the thought, right? And in fact, the character you spend the most time with in the game is your avatar. And you can develop a relationship with him. He becomes a friend and a buddy, and he follows your lead, right? He's your wingman. So that's one way to approach creating a relationship. And it's based very much on the style of gameplay. It's an RPG. So you're exploring the world. So you're in a sort of a friendly, curious frame of mind. So you can create an avatar that has a friendly relationship with you. But what if it's a super aggro, hostile, crazy action-packed game where you're fighting every single thing you see, and you're in this hostile, antagonistic frame of mind? Well, you can create an avatar that is the antagonist of the player. And this is something you really can't do in any other medium, but we can do it in games. So I'm going to show, just because this is such an old game, I'm going to briefly show the intro cinematic, and then we'll look at the structure of the story and how it worked. By the way, has anyone finished or people played this game? It's so old that maybe no one has. You have. You nodded. I knew you had. Okay, perfect. Well, I apologize in advance. I'm going to ruin some stories for you, but hopefully they've been out for so long that it doesn't matter anymore.
The gods of Olympus have abandoned me. Now there is no hope.
And Kratos cast himself from the highest mountain in all of Greece. After 10 years of suffering, 10 years of endless nightmares, it would finally come to an end. Death would be his escape from madness.
Okay. So, God of War has a very simple desire line on the back of the box. Kill the God of War, right? So great, perfect. Like, that's a very simple desire line. And I think a lesser writer would have said, perfect, that's what the character wants, that's what the player wants. Go, ship it. But they did something very interesting here. So the setup is this. At the beginning of the game, the gods, in the form of the statue Athena, which comes to life and says to you, Ares, the god of war, has gone mad and has to be stopped. You, the greatest warrior in all of Sparta, is the only one who can do it. Will you kill the god of war? And the expectation is that he'll say, yes, I hate him, I will destroy him, right? Which is what we've seen in games like Gears of War. But instead, he says something very interesting. He is quite sad, actually, and he says, I'll do it if you take these memories away from me. So two things happen there. One, now we know what he really wants, right? Killing the god of war is a means to an end. And two, as a person who's interested in story, I say, what memories? Did I miss a cinematic? What happened? Right? And so now I'm interested, like, show me how, first of all, you're a crazy killer. You obviously like slaughter entire armies. What memory for a guy like this could be so bad that he'd want to forget it? Hasn't he sort of done the worst a man can do already? What? So I play the game, and at the end of each level, I see a cinematic, and it reveals a little bit more of these dreaded memories. Just a little bit at a time, right? Enough to keep me playing. But as I get what I want, he is punished more and more. until the very end, the final horrible memory is revealed. And he kills the god of war, and he says, "Gods, I have done as you asked. Now take these horrible memories away from me." And the Greek gods come down, and in typical Greek god fashion, they say, "No," even though they said they would. They said, "We can forgive, but never forget the horrible thing that you've done." So Kratos, in a cinematic, says, "Fine, I will escape with the sweet oblivion of death." And he throws himself off the highest cliff, right, into doom. Perfect, problem solved. He hits the water, and then the hand comes down from the sky, snatches Kratos out of the ocean, and says, "The god of war is dead. There must be a new god of war. You will take your place in the pantheon among the gods, living for all eternity with the horrible memories of the things you've done." What? This is an incredible story to me because it provides, the player wins, I killed the god of war, and I got to be a god myself, bonus, and the avatar that I played is punished, and rightfully so, for the horrible things he's done. Catharsis. Bravo. That's good storytelling. So that's one example. Avatar as opponent. And the last example I'm going to talk about is Avatar as pawn. And I'm going to show, again, briefly the opening to BioShock, just to remind us all of it, and then we'll talk about how that worked. Pascal, what time do we stop? 20 minutes. Oh.
A man has a choice. I chose the impossible. I built a city where the artist would not fear the censor, where the great would not be constrained by the small, where the scientist would not be bound by petty morality. I chose to build rapture. But my city was betrayed by the weak. So I ask you, my friend, if your life were the prize, would you kill the innocent? Would you sacrifice your humanity? We all make choices, but in the end, our choices make us.
Got it. So BioShock is considered to have a pretty good story, but I'm going to describe the story from the player's point of view, right? From the player's, if the player were the protagonist and they were driving the game, the story would be about a guy who goes down to an underwater city, explores, kills every single person he meets until the very end when he meets a guy and kills him. The end. Like, that story is not going to win any awards, right? But the story isn't about the player. The game is about the player, right? But the story is about someone else. Who's the protagonist? How's that? Come again? Rapture. Yeah, well, Rapture, but really the man who built Rapture. That's who the story is really about, right? It's about Andrew Ryan. This man who, is an idealist and has a vision, and he builds a city beneath the waves, and it's where the best of the best will create a new utopia. And then it all goes wrong, but he can't admit defeat, right? This is a man with a strong desire line. He wants to save his dream. And he wants it so badly, he will save it or die trying, right? That's a storyline. A writer can work with that. An audience, a player can experience that story and be moved by it. And he can also have the agency of running through the world doing as he pleases, because the player character has no storyline. Really, except for gameplay, right? What he does is what the story is. But the BioShock was one of the first examples of like drawing a bright line between player story and game story. And the writers and the team created a very complex storyline and a complex character, and then let the player and designers develop their own experience. And then the two came together in surprising ways. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. So this to me was really a revelation. I loved finally being able to understand that. Oh, yes. Yes, I did. I worked on, I was brought in on BioShock 2 after Content Lock to try and help them out fix that story. Yeah. Which is the latest I've ever been brought on anything. I didn't know you could bring a writer on after Content Lock, but no. That's the question for drinks, not here. So the big, I guess if you were going to remember one thing that I said today, here it is, which is that I think that for years, games have made the understandable assumption that because the game is about the story, that the game is about the player, that the story is also about the player. And I would argue that's not the case. I think if you structure your experience that the story is about a non-player character, that's the protagonist, right? And then develop a relationship between the player and that NPC. That is a really powerful tool for storytelling. And if you have a game like Mass Effect 3 or God of War, where they're really, well, not Mass Effect 3, but like God of War, where there's only one character on screen, therefore he has to be the protagonist, develop a relationship between the player and the avatar so that there can be a place for the player to put himself into the story. Make sense? Because the player never stops playing as himself. So you have to give a role to the player. With God of War, you're the antagonist. You're the opponent. You are each other's opponent in a lot of ways. With Mass Effect 3, you are like buddies going through the world together. Creating a relationship between the player and the avatar is a really powerful storytelling tool that I think we're going to see used more and more. Okay, so I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about a couple of things that Jesse Schell, who I think is the smartest guy in games. Do you know Jesse Schell? He teaches at CMU. He has some talks that you can find online, and everything he says is phenomenal. He's the best speaker. And he said something that is so good that I'm stealing it and presenting it to you here now. And he talked about this prophecy that a gentleman, Chris Swain, made at University of Southern California. He said something really thought-provoking about the future of storytelling in games. And he compared it to film, as we so often do. And he says that movies weren't taken seriously as a medium until they learned to talk. When they were silent movies, people said, oh, they're silly, they're for kids, they'll never take it seriously, you can't do anything really meaningful or worthwhile with that medium, bah. But eventually, of course, movies did learn to talk, and they became what he describes as the literature of the 20th century. So what are we waiting for? Games know how to talk. We talk all the time. In fact, we probably talk too much. But we're not waiting for games to learn how to talk. What we're waiting for is games to learn how to listen and have a conversation with the player and have an engagement with the player where you feel like there are two people involved, the player and the game. And there's a call and a response, and there's a communication going on and a relationship. He argues that once we figure out how to do this, that's going to completely change things. And if we're going to do anything great in this medium, it's going to be in this space. And of course, technology is already exploring ways to make our machines talk to us and also hear us and respond to us. He said something really thought-provoking. This is my favorite part, which is this idea that a lot of us have been playing with this guy since we were kids, right? But every time you start a new game, he's like, it's a Mario. What's your name? What's my name? You know who I am, Mario. What are you talking about? We've been playing together forever. But of course, he has no memory. But what if he did? What if Mario remembered every game you have ever played with him and could play videos from past games from when you were 8 years old, or 10 years old, or 12 years old, or 20 years old, right? What if he was a persistent companion in your life and was with you your entire gaming life? And beyond that, what would happen to your avatar after you died? Not to be a downer, but we all are going to die. What if you could hand your Mario down to your kids or your grandkids who are also going to be playing games, but could play games with their grandpa's avatar? We already have persistent databases for games. Why not have persistent databases for characters? Someone's going to do this. This is going to happen. So imagine an avatar, a companion, who A, knows you, and B, can talk back to you and talk with you. What is that going to change for us in terms of storytelling and emotional engagement and connection? It's something that no other medium can do. And when we play games, we reveal so much of who we really are. I love this quote, not because it's such a great quote, although it is really, but I like who said it. This is how long we've been playing games. Video games are just a modern version of something that we are hardwired to do as humans. We play, right? And when we play as ourselves. Our true selves, our essential selves, who we really are. If we as storytellers could hold up a mirror to that essential self to show people who they really are, for better or for worse, and accept it, right? And embrace it and have a relationship with it, that could be the most powerful thing we could do for our audience and for our players. I think, in closing, I think that being a game writer in 2014 is like being a television writer in 1982. I think there was some good television back in the day, and I suspect that the people who were working back then in this medium thought, it's pretty good, but I bet we could do better. And I think that's how a lot of us working in this industry feel today. We're doing some good work, but what's possible in the future? I think the sky's the limit. The end.
Thank you very much. Absolutely fascinating. So I have a microphone, so I guess you guys have a lot of questions. So who wants to start? No question, not yet?
Don't be shy.
I have one
I
for...
see one.
Okay, yes.
Hi.
Hi.
How do you think multiplayer will factor into future storytelling?
What was that first word? How would what factor?
Multiplayer.
Oh, how does multiplayer?
Yeah. Do you think you can tell a story from different point of view, for different players, maybe each having their own goals and desires and connecting?
Yeah, I think that in terms of pure story, it makes it more interesting to have more than one character. I think it is challenging because it doubles the work. So if you have 4 characters, you really have 8 people to consider. Do you know what I mean? And the problem there is player tracking, right? Because players don't just sit and play a game like they watch a movie or watch a television show. They go away and they come back, and maybe you and I are playing together, and I've been playing every day, but you've been gone for 3 weeks. Wow, what do we do? So I think that's another structure challenge. It's another storytelling challenge. I usually work on single-player games, so I don't think I can say too much about that, but I do know that I tend to think about it in terms of like, I worked on a game that was a co-op, and we thought about it as a road trip. Like it was a car, and the players sat in the front seat, and the avatars were sitting in the back seat, you know? And so the avatars had to entertain the guys in the front, because the guys in the front had the car, right? So the guys in the back have to like buy the snacks and tell the jokes. Do you know what I mean? So I think it's possible, but I think we need to see more experiments in storytelling with multiplayer. We haven't seen a lot of experiments. We see the same mistakes being made over and over again. So I really get excited when I see games, even if they fail, especially if they fail, because we're not going to get anywhere until we start failing, right? By trying new things. Once someone starts trying and failing, and I would love for like indie space to find some way to do more multiplayer storytelling, because it's faster development cycles and smaller projects, so you can be more experimental, which is what we need. We need more experiments. Yes. You had a question?
Yes.
Yep. A complaint?
Just regarding what you just said, didn't Dead Space 3 try to do something like that? I think I remember the cooperation mode to feature scenes where the 2 characters didn't see the same thing and had to ask for help for the other player. And the other player wouldn't know exactly what was going on, so I didn't play the game. That's just something I remember reading about, but well, it seems to be one experiment in that way.
I haven't played Dead Space 3, but that's an interesting solution. That idea that you could break the story apart and give different pieces to different players. Like, that's a great strategy, right? I know who killed him, but you know something else, right? I mean, we could sort of, and I think the trick to developing relationships between characters in a game or between the character and the player, and this is something I said in the talk, but it's worth repeating. I think looking at the style of gameplay and the emotions that kind of game makes the player feel defines the kind of relationships the player is open to. So if it's a fighting game, the player is ready to fight. So have a lot of arguments between characters, right? And if it's a friendlier, exploring sort of a game, or if it's a horror game, right, where you don't know what's going on, it's smart to sort of hide parts of the story from different players. So it's a smart solution. Bravo, Dead Space 3. I didn't play it either, but now I'm going to check it out.
Another question? Yes, one. Oh, first here and then behind.
Bonjour.
Bonjour, comment ça va?
Bien, bien, et vous?
Bien, bien. Je suis fini, je suis super.
So I have a comment and an anecdote. When I was a kid, I used to play a lot of Japanese games, and I didn't understand the story at all. But I just imagine, wow, this guy, it's his sister, you have to say them. The story was great.
Your story was great, exactly. Every player has a great story.
Well, and my point is, well, several years later, the games eventually get translated. So I thought, great, I'm gonna see the story, I'm gonna understand the story. I play the game, and the story didn't match the expectation. And ça arrive souvent. Ça arrive quasiment tout le temps. And so my fear is that the story the writer tells never is as good as the player story. So how, as writers, how can we put that strength, weakness to our advantage?
Well, you're right. The player's story, even if it's terrible by objective standards, the player will prefer that because it's his, right? To a movie, right? Oh, no.
I read the second book first. I didn't quite, I had to feel the whole myself.
Yeah.
Then I read the first book, and it was disappointing.
Right. And I was going to say, it's also when people take a book and make a movie out of it, and people are like, that actor's the wrong guy for that role, because of course the reader has imagined, right, who it should be. Yeah, it is a problem. I think that, well, I mean, that's an unusual situation that you played an entire game with no idea what the story was and you filled in the blanks. Like, most people will be told a story as they play a game. And I think that's really what you're doing, is speaking to the talk very well, which is that the player is telling a story. You could bring Shakespeare himself back to life and have him write a story for a video game, and the player would be like, bah, right? Because you want the player to be engaged. The whole point of gameplay is agency and freedom and immersion, right? You want the player to feel like they're there. And humans are just born to tell stories. We do it to ourselves all the time. That's how we get through life. That's how we make sense of things. And so I think that the question is not, it's really important to ask the right questions. That's how I approach my job now, right? Am I asking the right question here? And so at first the question was, what's the best story I can write? I don't ask that anymore. Now I ask, how can I create something a story that will resonate with the player's own story? So what I do is I look at the gameplay and I say, what will this game make me feel? And then from there, I ask myself, what kinds of stories will amplify those feelings? Does that make sense? Yeah, so it gives room for the player to tell his story, and then the game story enhances his own, if that makes any sense, yeah? It's not a recipe, it's not a cookbook, but these are some basic guiding principles to use when working on stories for games that seem to help. I mean, I think that, honestly, 20 years from now, it will be so much easier to talk about this because the rules will have been laid down. I was just at an event last week, And I was talking with some people who work in theater, and they said that, it's frustrating having these meeting with other theater people because there's nothing new to say. We've totally figured out how to do storytelling for the stage. And I said, we have the opposite problem. We don't know how to describe what it is that we do. You know what I mean? Like it's a new medium, and it's like when you make, in the 1920s when like filmmakers were like, hey, what is that thing that we do where we push the camera so it's really close to their face? Let's do that thing. And eventually someone's like, you mean a close-up? Like, let's just call it a close-up. I mean, they have the words, we don't even have the words for what we do. Mm-hmm.
An analogy I can think of is music.
Mm-hmm.
As often jazzman says, holes and silence is music.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. They say that about art too, that negative space. Yeah, no, it's a great comment. And it's really interesting because usually game studios want the entire story to be very clear. And I think if it's going to be more creative, maybe it doesn't need to be so clear. But yeah, you tell that to my producer. Let's all talk to the producers. There was another question. I think you had one. Yeah.
Yes. Hi.
Hi.
So I was wondering, in your experience working on both single player and cooperative stories, are there certain benefits or that you've experienced, perhaps challenges that you experience with cooperative specifically compared to single player?
Yeah, I haven't worked a ton on cooperative. I did develop a storyline for. I guess I can say it, yeah. For Star Wars 1313, back when it was co-op. And we got the entire thing finished, and then they're like, let's make it single player. So, that was that for that story. But yeah, I mean, it opens up different opportunities, for sure. I mean, what I thought was, let's just speak theoretically. Theoretically, not a real project here, just, in theory. What you can do with a cooperative storylines is you develop two storylines for the characters, and one is quite what the player expects, like action-packed and like rock'em sock'em and action hero kind of stuff. And it's almost, it's like a magic trick. You sort of distract him with shiny over here, and then that gives you time to tell maybe a more complicated, subtle, nuanced story over here that is like a slow burn, right? Starts slow, but then gets better and better and better until suddenly it explodes in awesomeness, theoretically. So I think that is an interesting opportunity, that you can use that to weave different kinds of story experiences. And like I was saying, tell something that's a bit quieter and more, I don't want to say mature, but something that an older audience would appreciate as opposed to a younger audience. And that's a lot of what we try to think about, like who is playing this game? And if you have different audiences, you can design avatars that are going to attract certain segments. Like, here's the guy with a big gun. The younger players are really going to be interested in this guy because he can do more things in the game. And that's sort of what younger players come to games. I'm generalizing, right? But like, the younger players want to blow everything up, and the older players are more interested in story. Again, I'm being very general, so I apologize to anyone who I'm offending. But the more life experience you have, the more complicated stories you want to hear. And so you can tell a simple story for one audience, simple but great, and then something more complex and hopefully also great for the older audience. You know what it's like? It's like Pixar movies are great at this. So did anyone see Up? Yeah. So at the beginning of Up, there's this great segment at the very beginning where they show the storyline about the couple and how she can't have children. That's a storyline no kid is going to even understand, much less care about, right? But it's devastating for the adults because that is the saddest thing in the world. And I remember just being really struck because it was such a powerful emotional punch that like it really kind of made all the adults in the audience rock back on their heels. You just needed a minute after that. Like you're tearing up and you're like, oh my God, why is life so sad? Right? And so while the adults are sort of like reeling, the movie is like, la 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 la, and it starts the kid's story, right? The silly, fun stuff the kids are gonna get excited about. And so that story starts. And by the time the adults are sort of ready to re-engage with the movie, the kid's story is like well on its way. And so the kid's experience and the adult's experience are together. That's quite smart, right? Because if they only told the kid's story, the adults would be like, okay, I get it, let's go, come on, faster, right? Duh. But the kids need things told simply and slowly. And so they really sort of knocked out all the adults to buy time for the kids. Make sense? So this is what I think about when I watch movies.
Another question? Yes, no? Oh, yes, here.
What about godlike games, god games, and strategy games where there is not a strong narrative and sometimes there's none?
Like an
And
RTS, you mean?
there's a really big need for the player to be engaged to build his own story. So how does the writer copes with that to be able to give hints or to help the player build his story about his civilization or his world power or anything?
Do you mean like a real-time strategy game?
Yeah.
I had worked on one real-time strategy game, and I thought I was pretty early in my career, and I did a terrible job, I think, probably with the storyline. And I haven't worked on one since. So that's an interesting question. So I'll just think about it right up here, right now. I think, I mean, again, it gets back to sort of the frame of mind the player is in. So when I watch people play real-time strategy games, they're not emotional, usually. They're more thinking than feeling. Would you say that's true? There's a lot of strategy, right? So you're being strategic, and you're like, I could do this, or I could do that. When you think about how in the real world we use strategy usually during wartime, and the stakes are quite high. So one way you could possibly create some interest is like show that there are real things at stake for other characters. Not you, because A, you're God, and B, you're the player. The player, past the age of 4 years old, every player knows it's not real, right? And so it's very hard to convince them, like, this is life or death for you. And you're like, no, it's not, right? But for the players, the non-player characters who live inside the game, it is life or death. It's like Tron. Like, that's their world, right? And so if you wanted to go down that route, I don't know if that's the right route as I'm speaking, but if you did, you would want to create an emotional connection between the player and those characters so that they care about them and feel protective of them or of that civilization, you know? And then you're fighting for a purpose or for a cause, which I think, again, in terms of that fantasy, if you're a general and you're the military, you know, you are there to protect and serve. And so in the real world, you're fighting for noble causes, and you'd have to give the player a noble cause. That's one direction you could go, right? RTS is a difficult storytelling challenge. I think it really comes down to what the player feels. Are you an RTS player yourself? You know, you're not? You do? Yeah, so I mean, you could even ask yourself, what's fun? Why do I enjoy RTS? What's fun about it for me? Do I feel powerful? Do I feel smart? You know, is it the puzzle about it that intrigues me? I mean, that's an interesting situation too. So like a puzzle game, I'm just gonna take what you asked and run away with it. But puzzle games are interesting to me because they're also quite cerebral and you have to think about it. And so it opens up sort of like interesting possibilities, like, you know, Portal or Portal 2. It's interesting because you're put in this role of being, you know, you're one down, right? But it's fine because you're sort of busy solving a problem and you don't mind being sort of like not in charge of everything. You just need to be in charge of this one thing. And so they did a really nice job with the story meeting the player where they were at emotionally. So it's the opposite of what you're describing, which is you're solving puzzles but as a god. But the weaker you are, the better it is for storytelling, which is counterintuitive to games where it's like, I want to be the most powerful. Writers want to make you weaker, and game developers want to make you more strong, more powerful. So it's an interesting problem. I don't have a good answer for your question, basically. But thanks for asking.
Question here? Yes.
What I thought was interesting with RTS, StarCraft Command and Conquer, is that you're so detached from the story. Yeah. They made you play all the, you know, you play Protoss, then you play Zerg, then you play other sides, and you have a multi-point of view, like you were effectively a god.
Yeah. And, like you were a gun, you said? I'm sorry? You said like you were a what?
Like you were a god, because
like you were a god.
You command all the armies. All the
yeah.
all the things, and the story unfolds.
Yeah.
Just watching all the people fighting each other and enjoying it. It's very different kinds of story. I think it was very interesting with storytelling.
Did it work in your opinion? Did you like it? Yeah. That's cool.
For example, with the new StarCraft,
Mm-hmm.
you play just one race.
Yeah.
And I think the story was less engaging.
We have a question here. Yes.
What about the sandbox games? Can we consider, for example, that there is a story or is a desire in Minecraft? So there are many, obviously, different needs and tasks. And when you start, and the developers have provided a very high-end material that you can really reach, but some players really don't wish to get there. They can play for hours without going for that goal. Can we
Some players wish to get where? I'm sorry.
Oh, for example, in Minecraft, you can really go faster, you can go to the other side, you can kill the dragon, you can really go for this final goal, or you don't.
Right.
Basically.
Right.
So can we consider this like a story, that this game has a story?
Well, yeah, I mean, it brings up an interesting point, which is every story isn't a story until you see the end, right? Like, you want to get the whole experience, and games don't do a very good job of motivating you to get to the end, usually, I think. You know, you've played a level, and then you play the next level, you're like, okay, I get it, you know. So, you know, that is a very different beast. I mean, I guess when you say sandbox, I tend to think more like Grand Theft Auto, which in English, that's a sandbox. I mean, open world. Yeah, I mean, open world games are, yeah, I think that with an open world game, you've got to sort of have a very simple desire line initially, and then you can build a more complicated desire line underneath it. So by the time, hopefully, by the time the player gets interested in the story, the real story, you can sort of build multiple stories, right? So like, you know, and that's very common with stories in other mediums, that your desire line builds. So maybe initially you want to escape, and then later you want revenge. But you don't start out wanting revenge, right? You start out with something much simpler and easier to achieve, and easier to understand. And so you have a very simple goal, and as you pursue that simple goal, the world, the stage is set. You meet the other characters, and you get a sense of what's at stake, et cetera, et cetera. But the problem with open world, of course, is you come and go, right? And so I think in an open world game, again, like just standing here thinking about it, the most important character is the world itself. And this is something I didn't talk about in the presentation because I only had 30 minutes, but when I work on games, I really ask myself, what does the world want in terms of a desire line? So BioShock, great example, right? Rapture is Andrew Ryan, right? Like, it is his vision. And so as you fight Rapture, you're really fighting Andrew Ryan before you even meet him. Make sense? And so, I mean, it's not his vision exactly, but you know what I mean. So, and I think that that's something that's a tool we overlook, that the world itself could have a personality and a desire and a want. I mean, Mordor has a personality, right? Like, spaces have a feeling. And I think we can do more with that than other mediums can. I think we could use that because the player spends more time interacting with the world than it does with any other character. So therefore, that's where your emotional opportunity lies. And so I would play around with that in terms of that open world, because then it's also the player can get engaged with it or not. It doesn't really matter. The story world is there, and the player gets as interested as he wants to. It's a very simple answer. But
that was the last one. Thank you very much, Susan.
Okay, merci. Enjoy your lunch.